And I would like to welcome now in the round. Yes, you're live, you're online. We can see and hear you all already. The Honorable Edmund Bartlett, Minister of Tourism in Jamaica. Also, a very warm welcome to His Excellency Vassilis, Kikilias, Minister of Tourism and Antiquities in Greece. And we welcome from the Philippines, Maria Antoinette Velasco-Allones, Chief Operating Officer of the Philippine Tourism Promotion Board. Thank you to all of you for taking the time and talking to us here at ITB 2022. We just heard from Julia Simpson of the WTTC, and she indicated that policymakers have been very helpful in addressing crisis and facilitating the industry to be more resilient. That is good news. Do you believe, however, that there is more to be done? And what do you do as policy influencers to ensure risk mitigation to be more robust within the sector? And I would like to start with you, Minister Kikilias, because your government certainly led the EU in crisis response with the digital passport concept. Now you are driving a solution to address the coming refugee crisis, obviously Greece being situated at the southern tip of Europe. With what further anticipatory measures do you think can be in place across the globe to minimize future eventualities?
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for the invitation. In an unexpected time of crisis in the heart of Northern Europe, with a war, ongoing war, with a humanitarian crisis and a refugee situation, it seems like our pandemic and our global crisis of public health is already in a second framework. I'm very happy to be with you. I want to state out that tourism ecosystem resilience is at the core of our national strategy planning. While it is impossible to predict where the next crisis will come from, it's important to learn the lessons from previous crises and make critical choices, as well as undertake the structural reforms to address the economic, environmental, and social challenges related to tourism. So for Greek tourism, resilience is a powerful driver to boost risk and crisis management, capacity, and calls for the integration of economic, social, and environmental dimensions. In this respect, policies to strengthen tourism governance, support tourism investment, promote skills development, encourage digitalization of tourism, small and medium enterprises, and foster sustainable destination management rank high on our government's tourism agenda.
Now, I know that Greece, because that's not that far away from where we are, I know that Greece, just like Egypt and some of those other Mediterranean countries, that you have a large percentage of tourists from the nations inflicted in war right now. How do you already have measures in place? How do you balance your inbound travel mix and prepare for potential upcoming disruptions there?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, humanitarian aid, solidarity, and the human approach from Greek society to refugees from Ukraine. Our diaspora, we have more than 190,000 Greeks that live in Ukraine. Also, people coming from Pontus, but Ukrainian refugees too. We're there together with the rest of Europe. We have opened our borders. We are receiving families, children, unaccompanied children, women, refugees from the war, from the cities that have been under huge pressure, bombarded in this chaotic devastating. And we'll provide shelter, we'll provide food, we'll provide health measures, we'll provide mental support. And of course, if and when needed, on a second approach, more than 50,000 job opportunities in the touristic sector for people that want to stay for months or years in Greece. So this is our primary goal. Let's face it, of course, It's 25% of our GDP, our touristic project. It's a very, very important part of our economy. But primarily, we are aiming to helping people, accommodating people, supporting people in need. And that should be the essence of European and global coexistence and respect to the human life. Right after that, of course, we understand that we want to surpass the crisis, and we will. Everybody will, but primary is the respect of human life. This was the case in COVID-19 also, which the way we addressed it and we reacted to it made clear to everybody that Greece is a safe destination. It's a country that we did it, we delivered. We protected our citizens. We protected the foreigners and the travelers and the tourists coming to Greece. So in the same way, and with more resilience in a top priority for us and Europe, our policy is towards the people, first of all and primary. And then we're going to see what's going to happen with the sector. My prediction is that we're going to do okay, that we're going to do well. Of course, we're number 5 brand in the world, our touristic brand. But let's face it and be honest, nowadays, the top priority is a humanitarian priority, is assisting the people in need.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Kikilias. The first priority is to make sure that humans are safe, and then we deal with the rest. Thank you so much for those words. I would like to move on to Maria Antoinette Velasco-Allones from the Philippines. And she keeps smiling because I probably completely mispronounce her name. Apologies for that at this point. And I know that the Philippines have been championing the sustainability agenda long before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Additionally, the Philippines is inevitably affected by, weather-related crises mostly, also social impact when crises occur. That's also the nature of the geological setup of the whole region. What planning is done around preparedness within the tourism sector to allow quicker recovery from crises? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to greet everybody. Good evening from Manila, Philippines. And for some of you, it could be good morning or good afternoon. And no, you did not mispronounce my name. It was actually a perfect way for you to have pronounced it. So rest assured on that part. Thank you very much for that question. This is totally relevant to the Philippines, as you mentioned, that inevitably risk mitigation is important because the location of the Philippines within the Pacific Ring of Fire, puts us at the center of all natural calamities as well. And our vision for sustainability has compelled us actually to do planning with a whole of nation, not just whole of government, but whole of nation approach. And I was smiling because I thought that Julia's comment, just at the close of her interview earlier, was at the core of the reply to her question, which puts importance to how private sector and government has ironically, despite being physically disconnected for the last 2 years of the pandemic, we were actually stronger in terms of that connection, both for policy making and of course for sustaining the preparedness planning that in the Philippines has been institutionalized with our framework for a disaster resilience and risk mitigation system. So, of course, that the way we're set up is that there's a national government or a federal setup for other countries, and then we have local government units. So it is important that that linkage between the national and local government units is maintained. And it has, as Julia mentioned, those elements of trust and reliability and reliance, and both parties being able to supplement and support each other in terms of not just putting in place the policies that are needed to respond to these challenges, to how resilient our destinations are. There is a Filipino word called bayanihan, and this actually depicts our way of life, even before we were colonized by various countries. But this actually means that every member of the community plays a role in how the community is able to realize development goals, not just for that particular community, but for the entire members of the neighboring communities as well. Preparedness planning is one that has put in place also templates. So there are forms already to make it easier for everybody. And we are trying to sustain the inclusive and participatory way of planning. So our stakeholders, the community members, and as you mentioned, political leaders on the ground are at every step of the way engaged and involved in being able to put together, the plans, the needs. And as of now, as I speak, we're actually completing some assessment work in terms of damage, the extent of damage hammered by the Typhoon Odette, just as we were closing the year in December. So we are in the process of actually putting in motion what the plans have been in place in terms of responding to the damage and rehabilitation work that needs to be done in those specific destinations. And I think not only the participatory and inclusive manner of doing planning, but also, the need for us to really strengthen evidence-based and data-driven planning. So it is important, particularly for government, to really be able to leverage on technology so that we're able to have available data information in place so that policy and formulation of plans are well informed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. And of course, I mean, I know that you in the Philippines, you've done a remarkable job there. But I still would like to better understand the difference between crisis response, because certainly when we come to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was little preparedness because we just didn't see it coming.
And there was no playbook for that, right?
Yeah, and being prepared. There is a very clear line in between. And I mentioned earlier with the Philippines, and you have all these beautiful different islands and remote areas, and you couldn't prepare, and the people there obviously couldn't prepare for the fallout from the pandemic when nobody could arrive anymore. So you're now forced also to, as you said, also assess the damage from the pandemic, just like from the Typhoon Odette, in order then to rebuild and maybe create a blueprint for preparedness. How do you go about that?
Specific to the tourism sector, we actually formulated a tourism recovery and response plan. And that was formulated in partnership with the private sector and also the members of the community at the height of the pandemic in April and May 2020. And last year, just as we were closing the year, that has been revisited to include elements of, the additional crises that we had to meet, like Typhoon Odette that hit at least 3 of our key destinations in the Philippines. So in terms of the response plan, we have a national governance structure, which is called the National Disaster Risk Reduction Council. And this is actually the mechanism for integrating all plans, both in terms of risk reduction and mitigating the attendant damage that happens post-disaster. So this also incorporates concrete plans on the ground in terms of the aspects of the recovery. So there's infrastructure, there's also the social, economic elements of the plan that are put in place.
All right. I found it very interesting with the sort of risk plan, risk mechanism, because that leads me straight to Minister Bartlett, because that is a huge, huge topic. You've been very active in raising awareness across the planet, of course, on the need for preparation, mitigation, quick recovery. You are calling for February the 17th to be a globally recognized day, namely the Global Tourism Resilience Day. And you've created the Dubai Declaration for Global Tourism Resilience, within which you are proposing a fund, I assume a global fund, to assist affected destinations or peoples. I would like you to elaborate on that a little bit so that the others can eventually also react to it. But what picture do you think, if these mechanisms, these funds that you were calling for, if they come into fruition. What picture will we see in a year from now? How will your actions have taken root, and what kind of impact will they have had? Minister Bartlett.
Thank you ever so much, and good morning from the Caribbean and Jamaica, and good afternoon, good day, good whatever time of the day it is across the world to our listeners from this forum here at ITB 2022. Thank you so much for the question. The truth is that the trust towards resilience building, is not simply a matter of positioning the tourism sector to overcome and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is also about ensuring that the sector learns its lessons, adapts accordingly, and is better able to prepare for future shocks. You see, it is about ensuring that I think resilience building efforts are intertwined with the core of the global tourism ecosystem, and that all tourism partners, including industry leaders, governing bodies, policymakers, authorities, private sector, and the research and scientific communities are collaborating and engaging more closely to find long-term solutions to the exigent challenges confronting the sector that I think are linked to phenomena such as climate change and global warming, biodiversity losses, epidemic and pandemic, cyber insecurity, economic shocks, and other disruptive forces. I think at the heart of risk reduction and disaster mitigation strategies is the important task of preparedness and proactiveness. If it is one thing I think that we have learned from the current crisis is the importance of paying attention to warning signs, vulnerabilities, and gaps in operational framework, and indeed the context of the tourism sector, and responding decisively to enhance all systems, processes, protocols, structures, arrangements, and relationships to ensure a more resilient, responsive tourism sector. You see, too often the tourism sector is taken off guard, and we respond poorly to disruptive events that have either been forewarned or have occurred repeatedly. This approach, I think, is counterproductive, as the current crisis has shown. Thus, certain priorities in terms of promoting strategic investments, partnerships and innovations, and behavioral modifications, these must drive the resilience building efforts of our tourism sector. These efforts are likely to include the establishment of intelligent adaptive digital systems, optimizing health and safety protocols and practices, shifting to more sustainable patterns of production and consumption, to increase focus on segmentation and diversification strategies. Indeed, in the end, I think the goal of these priority areas is to ensure that the sector can mitigate risk before they escalate. While on the one hand, we look at that, we also need to ensure that the sector is prepared to deliver well-targeted and accessible support as quickly and efficiently as possible to vulnerable tourism businesses, workers, tourists, and others. I've given that sort of background in thought because I believe that this crisis that we have managed to ferret through a little bit, we're not quite at the end of it as yet. What it has done is it has called all our stakeholders to all levels of action, and we have to respond. And part of this response is to build capacity among countries, particularly vulnerable countries that are highly tourism dependent. And I heard my colleague from the Philippines making the point about where the Philippines rest in terms of the Ring of Fire in the Pacific area. And we in the Caribbean have that vulnerability in another way, more in terms of climate action, in terms of climate events, hurricanes. We do have earthquakes too, but hurricanes are the more frequent phenomenon. So building capacity to understand what these disruptions are, to be able to, first of all, observe and to track them, to mitigate against them, to manage when they actually come, to then to recover and to recover quickly, but more importantly, to thrive after recovery. And so we established the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center here in Jamaica. And we have been setting up satellites all across the world. We're looking forward to coming to the Philippines to do one and to also have one in Greece. I know that Laurie has been working in that area with Greece. But we, to that extent, established also now the Global Tourism Forum. And that forum kicked off in Dubai on the 17th of February this year, at which time we looked at a whole range of possibilities and opportunities that emerge when crises arrive. Because crisis is not all negative and bad. It does provide opportunities too for innovation, for pivoting, for creating new thinking, and to engage new processes. Right. So we know that disruptions are going to continue, because before the pandemic is over, we're in a war. And the war starting in the Ukraine, my God, and we're pained by it. It disrupts tourism significantly, but it does other things to the economies and to people's lives and to the psyche of people. So how do we build out then the capacity to provide resource support? And one of the big areas of support is funding, to be able to provide material resource through financial responses. And so we thought that the call for a global fund is a critical part of this, especially to enable recovery to be symmetrical, to enable recovery to be equitable, to enable no one to be left behind. And that's part of the concern with the rate of recovery, even as the pandemic itself eases off, that the countries of the world are not recovering together.
Right.
Large swaths of the world are still without vaccine.
That's true.
Enough.
I just have one question. I just have one question, Minister. Minister, you can proceed in just a second, but because you've been touching on this fund again, and I was really wondering, because I mean, the world, we have so many various funds already set up in order to help here, to help there. How would this Global Tourism Recovery Fund differ from the existing ones? Where would it be based? Who would be in charge of it? Who pays in? Who decides what is being paid out? The practical mechanisms, do we know that already, or is it too early to talk about that?
Well, I think that we're beginning to think that through, because you're right that the world has several funds. There are the gatekeepers, such as, you know, the World Bank. You have the UN mechanisms that can be mobilized to enable this. But I think that what is critical now is that we have the first time in Anthropocene Earth that every single human being was affected simultaneously by a disruption. So what this is calling for is for a global response. And I think that the UN should be the critical instrument through which this kind of mobilization could be realized. Because the UN constitutes all the countries of the world by and large. Nearly 200 countries. And I think that the thinking through of contribution, particularly from the larger and more developed countries, the ones indeed that are, in my mind, the real beneficiaries of the effort and struggle of the developing countries in particular, that the fund should find its genesis through the UN system, but should be supported by all countries of the world, whether by way of a cess on each country, by in terms of the GDP size of the country. I wouldn't want to speak about vulnerabilities, because then that would put the smaller countries at greater risk and their inability to supply the kind of support that would be required to make a significant fund.
Right.
So I think the private sector also has a big role to play. These large companies that are the users of the resources of the world, and whose actions sometimes precipitate global disruptions of various types.
Right.
That they need to come to the table and to provide support in that regard. So,
Thank you.
So the question you ask is apropos, but it also begs the question in terms of the collaboration that is required and how we are going to, over the next few weeks, months, pull the parties together.
Right, and this is
position.
actually where I would like to bring Mr. Kikilias and also Anthony and now
Antoinette.
I've lost Antoinette. Thank you so much. Now she praised me before, and then I fail miserably. Here we are. Now, where I wanted to bring the two of you back into this discussion, because I know, and Mr. Kikilias, we touched upon it, of course, tourism destinations in recent years thrived primarily by specializing on offering a certain service, a USP. We do something that the others don't, and this is how you attract your clientele. In times of crisis, when a natural catastrophe hits, or right now with this war on the doorstep of Europe, something I still find very difficult to actually grasp that is a reality. This kind of specialization can actually harm you, which means you suddenly lose out on a big chunk of a clientele, which is important to your tourism sector. And I know that you said earlier, of course, I think we all agree that the safety and dignity of human lives always has to come first. But of course, an awful lot of people also work in the tourism industry, and they also need to be looked after. So would diversification all of a sudden be the new recipe, the road to success? Or are you worried that you are then a jack of all trades and a master of none, and basically you have no hold anymore of the kind of tourists that you want to attract and cater to? Minister Kikilias, your thoughts, please.
Well, thank you very, very much for the question. If I may add, it seems like hard data is still in our favor. For example, today we received the first direct flight from the US to Eleftherios Venizelos Athens airport. They're going to be, from next month, 9 of them every day coming from the US to Greece. From the start of April, 3 coming from Canada to Greece, and from what I hear from Australia, a huge perspective after the 2 years that have been closed because of COVID-19. So we're still pole position, if not number one of the first. So I have all the reasons to be optimistic. But in this respect, the Greek government put at the center of the recovery the shift towards a sustainable travel and tourism experience by advancing evidence-based policy and harnessing innovation and digitalization in order to foster a more resilient, inclusive, and resource-efficient future for Greek tourism. To meet these objectives, a 4-step strategy is implemented. Primarily, rebuilding the industry with pandemic response and recovery plans. Second, refocusing governance policy to promote optimal destination management and marketing. 3, strengthening the industry to achieve sustainable, responsible, and smart tourism. And 4, planning the future of the industry by promoting the strategic adaptation, taking into consideration mega trends and changes that are taking place on the demand side that require adaptation of the offering. So for the day after, resilience for the tourism ecosystem is at the core of the national strategic planning. While it's important to predict where the next crisis will come from, it is important to learn the lessons from the crisis itself and make the critical choices, as well as undertake structural reforms to address the economy, environmental and social challenges related to tourism. And resilience requires leadership and coordination with proactive policy interventions, bringing together the main players both public and private, behind an agreed vision and direction.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Kikilias. Just one question, doesn't have to be very long. You mentioned megatrends. Can you be more specific? What kind of megatrends are we talking about?
Well, you see digital nomads, for example. Supposedly they are off-season because our main target is summer vacations, but we see big companies all over the world after the pandemic thinking that they can have some 10, 20 or 30% of their workforce work from home. So if home is cloudy, misty and rainy, why not make home shiny with mild weather and great food and leisure? So yes,
Like
we think that's a mega trend.
I'm there. I go for that immediately.
Sounds like Jamaica there, Minister.
Yes, Minister.
Antoinette, I was
Yes.
I was looking up at the kind of tourism structure. You know, what kind of tourists before the pandemic hit mainly came to the Philippines, and there was first and foremost a lot of tourists coming from China. Also tourists from the United States. South Korea as well, yeah.
Japan.
German were on that list still, somewhat further down,
Yeah.
but they were still there. That's nice to know. But of course, this also means, I mean, there is like a huge, like almost entire continent that is your main clientele to some extent. When something happens, in China, obviously, that's where the pandemic started, then you feel that immediately. I know that you also are very popular among divers. So do you see as a response to this pandemic, the lessons learned, if you like, a shift towards a different kind of tourist, maybe more domestic, or how do you respond again to this and maybe then make that a preparedness for future crises?
That's a super excellent question. And let me start by saying that actually, to begin with, we are already as diverse as we were before the pandemic in terms of the tourism portfolios and products that we've been offering. So our National Tourism Development Plan actually contains like 10 priority tourism portfolios that includes cruise and mountain and beach. So there are mountains in the Philippines. There are, of course, as you mentioned, we are globally cited for many of our diving sites. And then, of course, there's gastronomy. Our minister said that you can come here for food. And there's faith tourism or pilgrim tourism and the very rich culture and heritage tourism. What we did through the pandemic pause was to actually revisit these products, revalidate them, and prepare them again for the reopening. And which when we reopened last February 10, in a span of 3 weeks, actually now Germany is on top 5 of our arrivals in terms of the tourists that have come to the Philippines. Over the weekend, I went to Coron, Palawan. It's one of the beautiful diving and snorkeling sites in the Philippines. And lo and behold, every island I went to when we went island hopping, there were German tourists indeed. And as mentioned by the minister, I asked them, how long are you staying here? And then they said, well, we are self-employed and we have laptops, and so we can work from here. So I said, you are welcome to stay here for the rest of the year.
Digital nomads, there you are.
Yeah, they are. And they said, we miss this beach, we miss the sun. And so, yeah, we are staying indefinitely. So, and we are prepared for that. And
we had very bad weather, I have to say, over the last 3 months here in Germany.
Oh.
So, yeah.
So, yeah, perfect reason for you to come here. And as you mentioned, the Philippines, compared to other countries, was actually bigger in terms of tourism receipts from our domestic tourism. So prior to the pandemic, we counted about 110 million domestic trips. So not in terms of the actual tourists, but the trips made. That alone was 110 million, and that actually kept many of our open destinations through the pandemic. They were able to survive. So when surges would happen, we would close. And then when the numbers go down, then they will slowly reopen. We began experimenting with managing the capacity, like managing how many tourists are allowed to enter a particular destination per day, which of course links very nicely, with our thrust for sustainability. Because prior to that, there was lower consciousness for that. So last year I visited El Nido in Palawan also, and the boatman, not knowing I come from the tourism sector, he said, while we were waiting for our turn to get off the boat, he said, ma'am, I'm hoping that after the pandemic, this system will continue. So I asked, what system are you talking about? He said, just allowing the minimum number of boats to dock in a particular island at a particular time. So I asked why? Because our corals will not be damaged, and people will not crowd. And so I said, so even our guides, the frontliners, were beginning to appreciate the impact of us being able to manage.
Antoinette, that is a beautiful story, and I wish I could listen to it much, much longer. It's been such a pleasure talking to all three of you, and I would like to thank you very much, Edmund Bartlett, Minister of Tourism in Jamaica, Vassilis Kikilias, Minister of Tourism and Antiquities in Greece, and of course, Maria Anthonette Velasco-Allones, Chief Operating Officer of the Philippines Tourism Promotions Board. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Our pleasure and blessing. Thank you.